Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's talk with Dr. Amitha Kalaichandran. My name is Michael. On behalf of our owners Greg and Jen, thank you for coming. This event will be recorded for our YouTube channel it'll be up later tonight. So let's begin. The book we're talking about tonight is On Healing, Finding Wholeness Beyond the Limits of Medicine. And tonight's author, she blends her medical expertise with profound insights into integrative and lifestyle medicine. A fellow in integrative medicine, she is a sought-after speaker and has contributed to publications like the New York Times, Wired, and The Atlantic. As a renowned leader in health tech, she most recently served as a director of clinical content for Function Health and has held roles on the health design teams and board of advisors at Twitter and several startup positions, including at Hardy Health. On Healing is her first book. Please welcome from New York City, Dr. Amitha Kalaichandran. Joining the doctor is the founder and CEO of Guava Health, a Santa Barbara-based holistic health tech company, Dylan Wenzlau. Thank you, Dylan. All right, go ahead.
All right. First off, I just want to say I really appreciate you doing a deep dive from like the objective science perspective on some of these issues that are not normally talked about in like the medical field quite as often. So I thought that was really cool. It's good synergy with what we're trying to do at Guava.
Yeah, that's awesome. So thank you everyone for coming. So I love starting these events with a short reading. So this is from the chapter that covers social connection. And I love reading this chapter during events because when we come together in person, we all feel that sense of nourishment and connection, and that's a really key part of well-being and longevity. So this is the chapter that talks a little bit about a planned community in Atlanta called Serenbe. There's no formal vetting process for who gets to live at Serenbe. Residents seem to self-select. Those willing to pay a bit more to support community initiatives in the arts and other gatherings, and those willing to commute into Atlanta. Many are entrepreneurs who have the flexibility to work at least partly at home. The types of businesses that have sprung up also tell a story. A forest labyrinth, a wellness center offering classes in everything from goat yoga to guided meditation, a cold-pressed juice shop, and a fitness center. The highlight of Serenbe, though, is its sprawling organic farm in a neighborhood dubbed Range. And most people in Serenbe use the community farm. The residents are professionals, teachers, actors, doctors, and lawyers. This provides a nudge for neighbors to mingle as they walk over to buy their vegetables. A medicinal garden on the property does the same. Every year, Serenbe hosts two conferences, a biophilic leadership summit in April with city planners from places like San Francisco attending, and a fall developer conference for the wider public. Nygren, he's the founder of this, shares that he's working with other developers around the U.S. to consult on similar planned communities from upstate New York to Florida to Ohio and North Carolina. And he has founded his own consulting firm called Nygren Placemaking for this purpose. At least one such plan in the Midwest was a massive failure. They had everything but a Steve Nygren, one Serenbe resident told me. He had earned the nickname the Willy Wonka of Serenbe for a reason. He's a visionary, but also someone who's able to lead a collective and get things done. The takeaway is that this very approach can be applied to both neighborhood design and hospital design, something Nygren cemented for me. The two important components I see, he told me, are the connection to nature and the connection to each other. When I asked him about what in his early life motivated him to create Serenbe, he had an interesting answer. He grew up in a multi-generational household as an only child with an alcoholic father and a mother who constantly worried about their finances. I felt a lot of loneliness as a child, he said. I knew I was not going to stay on the farm or be sucked into that life, but I had to get away and find something else. I believed destiny was mine to make. Otherwise, I'd get trapped in that default destiny. And I had a lot of good examples of what that looked like, so I vowed to carve my own path. Later on, he followed his curiosity to ultimately lead him to re-envision what community looks like, undoubtedly informed by his childhood, which was wrought with the opposite, loneliness and a yearning to belong. Indeed, Serim Bay, which as of 2024 is home to 1,400 residents, has taken some of what we learned in Ogami Village in Okinawa, Japan, and brought it to rural Georgia. But it took someone like Steve Nygren and a passion for connection seated as a child to make it a reality. Yet loneliness is one thing. Social connections may help us prevent and treat loneliness, clearly, but does the evidence suggest that our social networks can go further to actually promote healing? This led to my conversation with two scholars behind the Okinawa longevity research.
Yeah, that was a good section. I liked hearing about Serim Bay, that's how you say it? Similar to a few other places, but maybe not as big or successful. Pretty cool experiment, I suppose. All right, I'll jump in and start asking a few questions now. So, in your book on healing, you explore 12 essential components of healing. Can you share how these elements work together to create a comprehensive approach to health?
Definitely. So the book covers 12 different components of healing. So most of them are part of the field of integrative medicine. Integrative medicine is basically elements of medicine that include things like sleep, nutrition, mindfulness, that have an evidence-based approach that really work hand in hand with conventional medicine. So it's not about an either or, it's how do these things work synergistically. And some other components outside of that system include psychedelic medicine, include history and story and the importance of understanding our own stories and origins, as well as the spiritual art of letting go and grief. We're constantly letting go of things, and that's a really key part of healing. And they work synergistically because it is really a system. So we can take the example of sleep. We've all been sleep deprived, and we know that when we're sleep deprived, we're less likely to make healthy food choices. We're less likely to emotionally regulate, which then impacts our work relationships and our personal relationships. We're less likely to go and exercise or go to the gym because we're tired. And if we do go to the gym, we're usually less efficient in our workout. So it all works synergistically. So if you improve in one element, all of the other elements improve as well.
Yeah, it's great. Very nice. Makes total sense. So your book emphasizes the role of workplace culture as well as a major determinant of health and well-being. What steps can organizations take to create environments that foster healing and prevent burnout?
So I love this question because when we think about wellness and healing, we often forget about the environmental aspects, and our work is such a key part of our lives, right? Unless you work from home, but even when you do work from home, if you're interacting with people, clients, businesses, and interfacing with them, and there's a lack of alignment, that will affect your mental health and well-being. And we bring the best, hours of our day, arguably, to our work, right? And so if there's a lack of alignment, and it could be a lack of a values alignment, it could be, not being aligned with your passion, that slowly eats away at us. And it might not be as obvious as something like smoking or, other things that we know are not healthy for us. But there is an element in terms of how it impacts our emotional health and mental health and our spiritual health. And that then actually trickles down to our physical health. So up to 70% of Americans at one point in their life have faced a toxic work environment. That could mean a work environment where they couldn't speak up. This idea of psychological safety, right? If something wasn't right, they may feel bullied, they may feel harassed, they may feel micromanaged. I mean, the list goes on. We've all either experienced it directly or know friends who have, and that really shows up in our mental and spiritual health, as I mentioned, but also the downstream effects on our actual physical health are very clear. And that means anything from cardiovascular health to bone health to metabolic health. The impact of stress, and that stress is really key. In terms of what leaders can take in terms of steps, that's where it gets a little bit interesting, and where I think we need a lot more creativity, because it starts with leaders that are self-aware, aware of their triggers, aware of their traumas, aware of how they're showing up, and really creating policies and environments that are actually actionable, right? We've all worked in organizations that maybe on paper have great mission statements, right? Or on paper have a list of different policies, but we all know what actually happens is not often on paper, right? So how do we close that gap, I think, is really, really key.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of examples now from the medical system of things that are, you're like kind of surprised when you read it. It's like, oh, interesting. That's really how it works. And sometimes you see examples of it. It was very interesting reading your take on that as well. It's a very personal experience for you, obviously.
Definitely. Yeah, so in the book I talk about, so the book talks about these 12 components, as I mentioned, but the whole reason why I entered into this journey of discovering these 12 components was I needed to heal myself. So I didn't face some really devastating diagnosis per se, but I did have experiences that maybe like burnout that were induced by the workplace. So the moment I left that particular environment, I expanded. I felt like I had my wings again. But I still wasn't quite healed and whole. And that's why, optimizing my sleep, my nutrition, social connection, finding more aligned work was all part of that. And that happens in hospitals, it happens in many other organizations, like all the time, right? But in hospitals, even though they're centers of healing, are not often the most healthy cultures, right? So doctors, physician burnout's really high, nursing burnout's really high. Does that trickle down into patient outcomes? Absolutely, right? We know that in cultures where hospitals are, or less healthy cultures, we have worse patient outcomes, right? Misdiagnoses, missed diagnoses, all of these kinds of things are downstream effects.
Yeah, definitely. So I think you answered this a little bit already, but my next question is, so your book starts with your personal story about the classical medical system not solving the area between totally sick and totally healthy very well, because it is the limited tool set of drugs and surgery. So as someone building technology, trying to address the whole picture as well, and not just drugs and surgery, I'm curious, what do you think should be invented on the technology side specifically? Maybe it's things that we can focus on at Guava. That would, like, which things are most important to help support not just the drugs and surgery side.
Right. Yeah. So I think framing it as sort of basically the challenge of seeing hospitals for what they are, which really should be centers where surgeries and procedures are done, right? Where there's sterile environments for those things to happen, and centers where people can recover from very acute conditions. 80% of healthcare is neither of those things, right? So what does that mean? That means that most of healthcare can happen at home, can happen in outpatient settings. A lot of health information and advice, including wellness and well-being advice, can happen through technology like apps. I think the tricky part is making sure that it's rigorous and science-backed and data-driven, right? And I think companies like Guava are doing that really well with chronic disease. And so I think in terms of what needs to be invented, is it's more like, I guess I would rephrase that as, where do we need to iterate? And I think it's, how do we combine personalized insights, right? So from personal data from a variety of sources. It could be wearables, it could be lab markers, it could be tests, with the best science in terms of management and treatment, as well as the preventative side of that. And how do we, think about delivering that care or that advice, in terms of prevention, in a way that's easy to understand from a content point of view, from a user experience point of view, incorporating a lot of the things that I talked about in the book, right? So what should you be eating if you have X, Y condition, right? Or X, Y symptoms, right? How should you be optimizing your sleep? All of that, I think, comes into the picture there.
We're trying to do some of those things a little bit, but it's very, very long way to go if we're gonna have a big impact on things that you talk about in your book.
Right.
So after one passage in your book, I had an immediate visceral reaction. Probably several of us at Guava would have a similar reaction after what we work on there. So you're talking about getting your MRI and knowing that the image was sitting on a screen a few feet away from you, but you weren't able to see it, and you also weren't able to get an initial interpretation. Then you said, a few weeks later, my doctor called, and I was like, a few weeks? So I think patients' legal rights have improved a little bit, maybe since then. So they can access, as of 2023, I think patients can access a decent chunk of their records from federal law. So that's good. But I'm curious, the question is that really better if patients do have immediate access to all their medical data? Or where's the line? Where's the fine line of what they should have access to, and when, and why.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. So in the book, I talk about this point where a psychologist thought that I had a specific condition, and won't spoil it, and believed that an MRI would help me. So I don't know if anyone's had a MRI before, but they can be very long, they're very loud. If you're not claustrophobic to begin with, you will become claustrophobic magically in that machine and have no way out. So that was me, and it was the first time in my life where I understood that gap between not knowing what's going on in your own body that you've lived in for your whole life, and knowing that someone else is going to have that information way before you will. And in that particular moment, I get out of the machine, and I, obviously I'm a physician, and so I talk to the lab tech, and I'm trying to kind of like, as I'm getting out, I'm trying to sort of look on her face and see if there's like signals, if she's like, but if, they're all professional, right? So no one's going to be like looking like Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone when they see something crazy, right? And I was trying to sort of like take a look, like, does she look, and I really couldn't tell. And I asked her, I said, I'm a physician, wink, wink, can you tell me like what's going on? She said, I can't, like legally I can't. And it's true, right? So a lab tech is not a radiologist, and if they say something that's incorrect, it can be a whole thing. And it was very anxiety provoking, as you can imagine, right? And having to wait several weeks and not knowing, like, was there something in my brain? Was quite difficult. And mind you, this was in Canada, so the legislation was very different in terms of access to records. We've definitely come a long way since then in terms of access to medical records in general, and I think on balance that's a really good thing. I think the challenge becomes when it comes to interpretation, right? So if you were to look at something or have a test and not know what it means, then there could be a lot of unnecessary anxiety that results from that. And having a physician, ideally someone with good bedside manner, really talk you through it, regardless of if it's a positive diagnosis or negative diagnosis, is really, really helpful. So that therapeutic relationship becomes really helpful. So it's a roundabout way of saying that I think it's a really good thing that we have access to our data and that we don't have to wait weeks and weeks and weeks. But if anything, it makes that relationship with your healthcare provider so much more important. To know that you feel like your partners in this healthcare journey. And I think with tech, the ability to create that partnership by basically leveling the playing field a little bit in terms of access to information is a game changer.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a better way to think about it.
How does Guava, just to sort of bounce off that a little bit, like how do you sort of see that in Guava in terms of health information? And
we try to operate pretty neutrally. Right now, we don't give advice directly, and if we do give something that looks like advice, it'll be like, the government said this, and then we'll link directly to where the government said it, or another authority. So we'll say that someone else said this, and we won't try to give them advice directly. Right. So we'll display the data. So if you upload an MRI, or if you have your lab results from a doctor, we'll show those to you, and we'll show perhaps the standard range, and say that this is what the CDC says is green or red or whatever it is. But we won't provide interpretation after that. So we won't say like, oh, this means you have a disease of some sort or something like that. And we make it easy for people to, share with their doctors so they can go get deeper advice.
Right. So it sounds like Guava is sort of closing that gap a little bit. Like you have basically pointing people to the best possible resources to make meaning themselves, but then allowing them to have that final sort of discussion with their physician. And I think that's really good, because I think previously it was very much about being in the dark and then suddenly waiting for your doctor to say it. So it sort of levels the playing field a little bit.
Yeah. Funny story. Our first viral post where we got a lot of Guava users all at once, it was because an influencer we were working with, this was on TikTok, she said, want to know what your doctor said about you in your medical record,
Right.
you can go sign up to Guava, and so people went up to sign up to Guava, not necessarily because they needed it, but
Right.
because they really just wanted to sync the records and see what were in the doctor's notes,
Yeah.
which of course is the interpretation a lot of the time. But so many of these people, like they were sharing what they found, they're like, oh my gosh, I never knew that my doctor said this about me. Some people were mad, some people were like, oh, this is interesting, useful information that I'm going to go talk to someone about. So it's people are very, very interested in it. That's why it went viral. So it's interesting conclusion for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating, and I think this whole sort of open notes movement, I think, has really made some really good waves, and I think it's also changed how physicians practice, and especially how they document. So it used to be the norm for physicians to kind of editorialize their patients, right? To say, Ms. So-and-so, difficult patient, right? To signal to other healthcare professionals that will see the record, like, okay, this is someone who's going to keep you on your toes, and I think the intention was probably good in many ways, but you can imagine if you read that about yourself, that's not pleasant, right? So it's also changed how people document to just be a little bit more professional in that way. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting kind of evolution in documentation for sure. And I think, and there's places like Estonia that have done it for many, many years, where it's almost like, I think about for 10 or 15 years, you could basically look at your medical record like a Microsoft Word or Google Doc and make comments. And this is actually helpful if you think about it, because physicians don't always get it right? If you think about like how much happens in a physician visit. So they may say, the symptoms started in September, and then someone can go in and be like, actually they started in April, right? So that also helps build that partnership and makes it less of a paternalistic connection, and ultimately would ideally lead to better care, better diagnoses, that sort of thing.
Yeah, from the patient side, we've definitely gotten maybe a surprising number of people very, very interested in editing their records. So it's like, hey, how can I add something here? How can I mark this as incorrect? How can I go change this to be a peanut allergy instead of a walnut allergy?
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah. How do I change this from being not a difficult patient to being a wonderful patient?
Exactly.
Maybe not.
All right. So one problem with the medical system that you talk about in your book is how hospitals sometimes put medical staff through 24 to 40-hour workdays, which lead to errors and worse patient outcomes. Given that we at Guava focus on patient empowerment, my question for you is, what role do you think patients have to help ensure they still achieve good outcomes in cases like this, where maybe the medical system doesn't operate quite perfectly?
Yeah. So in one of the chapters, the chapter on sleep, I talk about this case of Libby Zion. So this was a little girl, actually she's a teenager, in New York, and it was a tragic case where she was cared for by a couple of very sleep-deprived medical trainees, of which there are many, and there was a medication error that led to her death. So her father, Sidney Zion, happened to be a journalist and happened to really investigate this, and that was one of many different things that led to legislation change in terms of shift work and the number of hours. So you can imagine if you're flying, if you're a passenger in a plane, if you knew that your pilot was up for 48 hours, I mean, that's pretty scary, right? So now imagine someone doing surgery who is incredibly sleep deprived. Are they more likely to make a mistake? Yes. And so there's been some changes there. So as it relates to advocacy, I think a lot of that initial advocacy did lead to legislation. In terms of right now, I think it's always, I think we're at an interesting time where we have access to really high quality information now, and especially with access to different AI models. They're not perfect, but just the ability to access and interpret information is just much stronger now. And so being armed with that information, being able to communicate that obviously professionally and kindly and compassionately with your healthcare provider, I think is a really important part of making sure that you have the best care, right? And so whether it's yourself or your loved one, if you're finding yourself facing friction in the system for various ways, I think now more than ever, I think you should be empowered to speak up, to clarify, to ask questions. I think gone are the days, generations ago, where someone would just go into their doctor's office or clinic and just say, basically nod their head and say, okay, whatever you want me to do, doc. You know, I think those days are pretty much over. And I think on balance, I think that's a good thing. Again, it leads to that sort of partnership. And I think feeling like you have partners in your healthcare journey is really key to getting the best care and living a long, healthy life.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just mention one of the things that we do right now that is trying to bridge that gap a little bit is our it's a pre-visit summary for providers, so it allows the patient to put down data and notes and questions in like a printable format. So that's one of the ways we help them get more information to the doctor and make sure that something happens that they're trying to get done.
Yeah, exactly. It's like being able to any tool that you have that can empower you to ask the questions that you feel need to be asked, take down the notes that you feel like need to be taken, and just again feeling more empowered, feeling more aware. Because often if you're kind of going in blind, I mean, I think about if I have car trouble, right, and I go into my mechanic says you need to replace your brakes. I'm not going to question the mechanic because I have zero information, zero knowledge. I'll just believe them, right? Because I don't want to risk an accident. I think healthcare was like that for many, 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 many years. And finally now more people have the knowledge or have access to the knowledge, are empowered to ask the questions so that you can actually like clarify, right? It's not about pushing back or being difficult, right? But it's about your health, your body, asking the questions that make sense to you, and feeling like you're on the right track to meet your healthcare goals.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, maybe a spicier questions. Second to last one here. So clearly, many positive and negative things are being said in the U.S. about RFK Jr. and the new administration with respect to health. What are you hopeful will be implemented or not implemented that will potentially help with healing in this country?
Yeah, and I think again we live in a really interesting time. It's a very divided time. I think the key word here is nuance, and I'm a believer. I believe that most people have good intentions, and I think nothing is really black and white, right? You can have a leader who has certain views in one area that probably make a lot of sense, then other views in the same area that don't make a lot of sense, right? We all have friends and family members like that too. So I think this is sort of a case of that. I think a lot of the new leaders that are coming into these positions, right, whether it's the FDA, HHS, are not the typical leader that we've seen. And sometimes that can be a good thing, right? Sometimes that can be a bad thing. Disruption, just as a term, has many different connotations. You know that in tech, right? In medicine, if you're a disruptive physician, that is a bad thing. If you're a disruptive tech company, that's a very, very good thing, right? So thinking about someone like RFK or people like that, when you look at the issues that they stand for, again, it's like some of it makes a lot of sense, right? If we think about, even just access to healthy foods, being more aware of legislation around environmental exposures and toxins, and all of these different things that are very different in the US than they are in Europe or Canada, where I'm from. So there's a lot of potential there, right? But then we have the other side of it, whether it's vaccines, whether it's like a bunch of other issues that obviously are touchier topics because they're less linked to the science. So I think all that to say, I think as people that live in the US, I think all of us, again, need to be more informed. We have access to accurate information, make decisions that align with the best science, the best evidence that we have, as well as our own experiences. And I think we just need to really sort of stay tuned to see what could potentially manifest. And I think in any government, you'll have leaders, but then you'll also have a number of different advisors. And I think any good leader is someone that surrounds themselves with people that have knowledge and expertise that they don't have. And that's what I would hope for, is that where we're seeing gaps in experience or expertise, that they'll surround themselves with people that have that, so that they can make the best possible decisions and choices and policy change for all Americans.
Yeah, I like your points of nuance and transparency. We seem to have been not as good at nuance in the last 10 years, more maybe political battles than necessary. But then in transparency, that seems to always be generally pretty good for health and technology. People can just see what is, or this is what hospitals charge, for instance. Then they can compare and try to make good decisions for them. So we're on the patient empowerment side, so we like transparency.
Yeah, I mean, transparency is key. I remember in the hospital one time, I started noticing that other physicians would order lab tests, so the order would be electrolytes, right? So electrolytes would be sodium, potassium, chloride. And oftentimes we'd only really care about one of those electrolytes. So oftentimes it was potassium, sometimes it was sodium. And so I actually went down to the lab one day and I said, can we just order a potassium if we just want a potassium? And they said yes. And the difference was like a few dollars. So if you multiply that by like millions, right? And this is a transparency thing because most people didn't really think about that. And I hadn't really thought about that until just randomly. And so information and knowledge is power. And I think when we think about things like waste and how to reduce waste and cost in our system, I think we need to be asking a lot of those questions. Nuance would be a great tech company name, by the way. Nuance Health.
Isn't there? I think there might be like a.
Is there really?
AI
called Nuance.
It's a Nuance. I think it's a data company, isn't it? Nuance.
I don't know. Maybe.
It rings kind of a bell. Probably multiple.
We're gonna get like an ad in YouTube saying, "I know."
All right. Last question I have written down. So the wellness industry is a $6 trillion market, and much of this stuff that's like sold in the public is not yet scientifically validated in the same way that some drugs and some surgery, or I guess most drugs and surgery in the U.S. are. So how can we integrate evidence-based practices with wellness trends like this in a way that both builds trust and legitimately helps people improve their health?
Yeah, so it's a multi-layered sort of question. I think there's a multi-layered answer for it. So the first is that the wellness industry is growing I think 25% every year. So I think a year or two ago it was like 4.1 trillion, now it's 6.1 trillion. And that includes like medical spas, that includes yoga retreats, that includes gyms, that includes Guava Health. It includes many, many things. And I think on balance, it's a good thing because it shows that consumers want to get healthier and that they're seeking opportunities to get healthier that go outside of the walls of the hospital. The caveat is that a number of these companies are not, or I should rather say, a number of these companies are taking approaches that might not align with the science and the evidence. And I don't necessarily think, again, that that's bad. I think there's nuance there because a lot of the things that keep us healthy and well may not have a randomized controlled trial or systematic review, right? So I much prefer the term evidence-informed rather than evidence-based because we just don't have studies for everything. So I think that's one point. I think the second point is that there are companies that have been a little bit more liberal in their use of science, meaning that it's not science-backed at all and potentially could be harmful. And so this is where we think about things like very extreme trends, right? Some of the biohacking trends might fall in that category. The other element of harm is the amount of information. So we don't think about this enough, but there's kind of a tipping point where too much data can actually be harmful because we don't know how to interpret it. We don't know how to make meaning of it. It's like too many data points. It's like too much noise, right? And so that's sort of the other thing. But what I would say is in terms of reconciling those elements is really taking the best of what we know from the science, taking the best of what you know from a lot of these lifestyle approaches, which I talk about in the book, like sleep, nutrition, social connection, a lot of things that don't actually cost very much, but require a bit of intention and energy to actually make those habit changes. And putting that all together in a way that makes sense for you, that is high on the potential benefit and low on the potential harm. And what I mean by that is like sometimes when we think about evidence-based, we forget that like things that actually help people may not have a study behind it, but it may not be harmful. So chapter 7 talks about like spirituality and prayer and psychics, right? Like it's the one chapter that's a little bit out there, but there's a lot of people that get a lot of healing from tarot readings, from psychics, from praying. Is there a study or multiple studies that show that it'll heal you? Not really. There's some interesting evidence that I talk about, but the chance of harm is so low, or the risk of harm is so low, that it's not something necessarily worth pushing back against. So I think that's where we're kind of at this point in time, is we're seeing this merging of science and then these other sort of wellness stakeholders. And I think as a consumer, as patients, as members of different platforms, making informed choices that have that balance that makes sense for you in your journey.
I like what you said about trying to make use of what science is out there that could be helpful to, you know, make your product better or use it for the right purposes, because the number of clinical trials for things is very, very small. Like it's a very small number of people, very small number of, you know, things, drugs that are actually tested. One of the things that we recently launched actually is a public insights board where people can post an insight they found within Guava, which said like, and it can be anything. People can log custom types in addition to all the standard medical things like, you know, your blood pressure. So someone could share, oh, my symptom got 40% worse when I started doing this therapy, or when I started taking this drug, or it got, you know, 20% better when I don't know, took a drug or did I don't know, more steps in the day or something like that. So it's definitely not a clinical trial, very far from that. But hopefully we're doing a step in the right direction toward making more use of like somewhat scientific things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love that idea, and I wrote an article for the British Medical Journal several years ago about crowdsourcing diagnoses. So how there's some platforms that help physicians crowdsource really rare diseases. So I say they see a patient, they're not really sure what's going on, they can post on here, and then physicians around the world can be like, hey, I actually saw a patient like that, this is what I think they have. Now with AI, it's probably a bit easier, but I think the same principle around posting insights and it's sort of like that crowdsourcing concept. Like you're sharing it with the community gives you feedback, the community then, you know, takes that, you know, data point and it may impact someone else's life in a positive way to give them some ideas of what they can do. So I think anything that involves community and coming together on like different healing journeys, I think is really powerful. And we've seen that even with, I mean, there's tons of Facebook groups, there's Reddit threads dedicated to different health conditions. And we really see the power in that, because when people feel less alone in different health challenges, and they feel like they're not having to experiment in all these different ways on their own, I think there's just a lot of power in terms of the healing potential.
Yeah, agreed. So that's all the questions I had. I don't know if we want to do.
Does anybody have questions?
Q&A?
Yeah.
I had a question. I'm going to read your book. And so maybe you answer this in the book, but I wanted to see when this journey outside of traditional medicine started, like chronologically, or how long you've been doing this particular path.
Yeah. So it really started in 2014. So it was a while ago. It was about, I guess 10 years ago now. And again, I was basically facing my own health challenges that were impacting my body, my mind, definitely my spirit. And so that's when it started. That's when I started reading about like integrative medicine online. And then I did the fellowship through the University of Arizona a couple of years later. So I've been really following all of these principles for about 10 years. Starting with I would say the biggest one is sleep. So sleep is a good example because, and more of us are aware of this now, but what I realized for myself was when I basically design my life as much as I can, we don't always have control over everything, but if I can design my life in a way where I know that I can get 7 or 8 hours of sleep, that helps make other decisions easier, right? So if I know that I'm at my best cognitively, I can focus better, I'm at my best emotionally, I can emotionally regulate better, I'm at my best when I'm energized and I'm rested, because I'm more likely to go to the gym, I'm more likely to socialize, then I just feel better automatically. And so it makes other decisions. So for example, if there's an event that runs until like 2 in the morning, I'm less likely to do that, right? identify, you know, alcohol is another one that we sort of is in the news more now, but even one glass of alcohol impacts your sleep architecture, your, the quality of sleep that you get. It doesn't mean that, you know, that I will never drink, but what it does mean is that I take that moment and ask myself, is it worth not being rested tomorrow to make this choice, right? And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And so it's really changed how I make these choices. And so the journey, you know, like with anything, the journey never ends, right? We're all a work in progress, but having that awareness has really shifted a lot for me. Yeah.
Was there something while you were researching this book that you were surprised by?
Yeah, I was more surprised than I thought I would be around the workplace culture aspect. And I think I was more surprised that it's not talked about enough, because people vent about work all the time, or they, you know, or everyone has like a story that they can share, but we don't often make that link between work and well-being. And oftentimes when we think about culture, we think about, especially if you've worked in tech, we think about things like ping pong tables and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying those are necessarily negative, but the fundamentals of a good culture are like mindful leaders, feeling safe at work, feeling like you can bring your whole self. And I'm not saying like bring the self that you know, when you're with your friends on a Friday night, right? But where you're not sort of feeling like you have to hide behind a mask, because that takes energy. And I wish more and more of us were aware that like how much that can take a toll when you're not yourself, when you're faking it in any context, at work, in relationships. It actually takes a toll on your physical health and your mental health, and you can't get that back. Like, it's really hard to reverse. And so that I think is probably the most surprising.
Any more questions?
I'm kind of curious about, you mentioned how stress can impact us in so many different ways, but are there like specific ways that kind of different types of stress can manifest, do you think? Just in like day-to-day life, like do you think it's like your stress from, you know, work is different than stress, like it impacts you differently than stress from, say, like, you know, your relationships or something?
I think that's a really good question. I haven't thought about, or I haven't come across research that distinguishes like different stress and different sort of
Right, because it's all just like cortisol spikes, right?
Yeah,
so
it's
like
definitely, there's definitely the hormone aspect. And I think to take a step back, like stress in itself is actually not inherently negative, right? Again, the word nuance. It's not necessarily negative. It's the type of stress and the amount of stress. And there was like this, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson law, but it's like this graph that, you know, you teach in Psychology 101, and there's people that poo-poo it and stuff. But it's a very simple idea that like there's a point where stress can actually be very helpful. So we can think about the impact of when you're a little bit stressed, it actually helps your motivation. It helps you perform better, right? Runners, just before they sprint to the Olympics, are super stressed. You know, they're not necessarily super calm, right? But they don't sort of pass that point where they're so stressed that it's maladaptive and they don't want to run, or they have an anxiety or panic attack. So that's one part of it. I think the second part of it to think about is this idea of hormesis. And hormesis just means like intentional bits of stress that actually help your body and your mind build resilience. Examples of that: cold plunging, which I think Dylan's a fan of, saunas, you know, anything that's sort of like little bits of stress. Fasting, intermittent fasting can be little bits of it. It actually helps your DNA repair a bit more efficiently. So that's one side of it. Now coming back to sort of the types of stress, whether it's workplace or relationships, the toll that it takes when it's not addressed can be really devastating, not just mentally and spiritually, but we see changes in your blood vessels, which impacts your risk of heart disease, among many other kinds of things. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question squarely, but what I would say is that understand a few different points about stress, that there's different types, that stress in itself is not bad, but that if you are dealing with chronic stress, whether it's at home or relationships, trying trying to get into the zone of, okay, what is within my control to shift this? And it doesn't have to be devastating or devastatingly like large of a decision, right? It doesn't mean necessarily quitting your job right away if you're, feeling chronic stress. But it might mean thinking about what your next few steps might be. It could be, how do I change my CV, or how do I start looking for other jobs, or if it's a relationship thing, how do I start having those difficult conversations? And just the impact of knowing that you have agency or power does a lot for the stress response.
Her book is on healing. Dr. Amitha Kalaichandran, thank you for joining us today. And Dylan, thank you for being a great interlocutor. Thank you.